Hey y'all, Jackson Hayes here. So it's been a little bit since I've done a traditional YouTube video. I mean, previously we had the Verso film that I uploaded to the channel, but that wasn't a normal YouTube video. So I thought I'd finally make, a normal YouTube video after taking about a month break. I just mainly wanted to focus on Verso. So, just decided to put YouTube on hold. But now we're back. Today we're talking about ND filters. So before I explain what ND filters are for those who don't know, let me first explain camera exposure. So there are three main settings when adjusting exposure for your camera. You've got your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO. With shutter speed, that determines how fast the shutter is moving across the frame, and it therefore determines your motion blur. If you've got a very fast shutter, you're not going to get a lot of motion blur, whereas if you have a very slow shutter, you're going to get a lot of motion blur. With ISO, that's how sensitive your sensor is, and so basically the higher the ISO, the brighter the image. However, the higher the ISO, the more grain and noise you get, so you kind of want to avoid the higher ISOs. You want to stick to a pretty low ISO or your camera's base ISO. And then we have aperture, which is how wide open the lens is. The wider open it is, the more light is let in. Smaller it is, less light obviously, but it also determines your depth of field. So the wider it is, the more shallow depth of field you have, and then the smaller it is, the deeper the depth of field is. So I explained all those camera settings to lead into what settings you should have for shooting video. So when you're shooting video, you're typically shooting something like 24 FPS. I know some people who shoot like 30 or 60 or God forbid 120, but those are their life choices, and I'll respect it even if I don't necessarily agree with it. But if you don't know what to be shooting in, you should probably be shooting in 24 FPS for everyone's sake. But when you're shooting any frame rate, your shutter speed should be double your frame rate. And the reason for that is that the motion blur looks the most natural at that point. So this is, right now we're at double the frame rate. The shutter speed is double the frame rate, so our motion blur is fairly natural looking. If it was too high, things would look super jittery. If it was too low, everything would be super blurry. So that's our shutter speed setting. For ISO, like I mentioned earlier, the higher the ISO, the more noise you get, so you want to be pretty low on the ISO. You want to be at your base ISO, ideally, but if you can always duck it down, but you don't really want to go too high. So our ISO, again, is going to be set pretty low, maybe ISO 100 on some cameras. You might want to go to ISO 400, like on my Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K. But yeah, ISO is going to be pretty low. And then aperture, that's pretty much determined by how much shallow depth of field you want. Right now, I'm at f2.7, so it's not as shallow as it gets. I can go down to f1.2, I think, on this lens and this setup. But right now I have it at 2.7 just to make sure that my face is actually in focus and not just my nose. Now, I have to pull focus manually, so there's a very big chance that this whole video is going to be slightly out of focus, but hopefully that's not the case. But anyway, my aperture right now is set to f2.7. Alright, so once we have all those settings set, our exposure should look pretty decent for the given environment. However, say we go outside when it's daytime. Right now it's night, but if it was broad daylight, we went outside, all our settings would be wrong, because inside obviously is a lot darker than it is outside, so we'd have to make some changes to our settings. The problem with doing that is that we can't adjust too much, because shutter speed is already set to double our frame rate. We can't really change that. I mean, some people crank the shutter, but that's their choice again, and yeah, but we don't really want to change that all too much, so that's out of the picture. And then we have our ISO, but if that's already at the lowest, well, you can't really change that anymore. And then aperture, you don't really want to crank it down to f22, because your shallow depth of field will just be gone. Everything will be in focus, and that's just not that great looking in some cases. In some cases you do want to stop down, but oftentimes you want a little bit of separation, so we can't adjust that either. So what can we adjust? Because we can't tweak any of those settings. Well, that's where ND filters come in. ND filters are basically like sunglasses for your camera. They go in front of the lens, although sometimes even behind the lens, and they just bring down the overall exposure of the image. And as you might imagine, they are very useful for shooting outdoors in bright locations, things like that. So there's this company called Goeb that makes ND filters, and they make them for not a lot of money. Now they have some pricing tiers, some are more expensive than others, but yeah, they make some really great ND filters that you can pick up at varying price levels. And Goeb was kind enough to send me their latest and greatest variable ND filter, which allows you basically to twist it and adjust how much ND is being applied. And that's super handy, especially when you're going outside and the light levels keep changing, things like that. You don't want to keep like screwing on and off various NDs or like constantly changing your ISO. You can just do this little dial thing and it makes it super easy. Now, my thoughts on the variable ND filter, I think it's awesome, especially because it has these little stopping mechanisms inside where basically you can't twist it so far that you start getting the crosshairs, which is what plagued some of the older variable ND filters, because you would go too far and then you would start getting the like cross polarization stuff. I think that's what it's called. I might be wrong, but that's what would happen. You get these ugly X marks. So basically these prevent you from that, and they just go from one range to the other and allow you to adjust your exposure very easily on the go. I recently got to test out the Goeb ND filter quite extensively, shooting pretty much all day with my Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K, which is just a lovely name, and with my 18-35 Sigma lens with the Goeb in front of it. And so since the whole thing was outdoors, I was able to adjust exposure as needed. We kept getting cloud coverage, and then it would go away and it would come back, and so the exposure levels kept changing. So being able to adjust that on the go was extremely helpful. So here's some footage using the Goeb filter on the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K, all outdoors. This is from that wedding. Let me know what you think. I think it worked really, really well, and just being able to get really good exposure while outside, maintaining my aperture, shutter speed, ISO, all of that was just, was very, very nice. Well, that's it. Thanks so much for watching. If you liked this video and found it helpful in any way, hit that thumbs up button. If you enjoy cinematic filmmaking and photography videos, hit that subscribe button and pop that bell. Thanks, and I'll see y'all later. So a company by the name of Goeb reached out to me. No, I reached out to them. Ha, I'm not that much of a popular person. Oh man, okay. That was depressing. Please. And basically, you want your shutter speed to be double your frame rate. Let me start that over. Oh, and my light died, so I'm going to turn that on real quick. Oh. And then aperture, we don't really want to stop down to like f27, or, well, you actually can't do f27, but f11. Yeah, that didn't sound as good. If you don't know what frame rate should be, it's like annoying when you like had like something kind of natural at first and you're trying to recreate it later.
Yeah, like
It's
the
very hard.
respecting Jason.
Yeah, yeah, okay. So when you shoot video, you're typically shooting something like 24 FPS. I know some people who shoot like 30 or 60 or, God forbid, 120, but